Hey there, fellow gardener. Welcome to my February garden guide, which gives you ideas on things to either start from seed or transplant right now. February is an important spring garden planting and seed sowing month for those of us in the southern parts of the United States, zones 8 through 11. If you want the earliest start on your spring garden, which also means more time for plants to produce and for you to harvest, then you need to get started now. This video will guide you on everything that can be started from seed or transplanted this month. If you're new here, hello and welcome. My name is Jara and I teach people how to garden and grow food. This video is one of many garden guides that can be found on my channel where I share my knowledge about growing food and other edible plants. So make sure you subscribe to my channel if you want to develop your gardening skills. If you have been following me for some time, you all know that I do a garden guide every single month to help keep everyone on track. If you want to see the other months, check out my monthly garden guides playlist or join my email group and I will send it to you automatically at the beginning of each month. I'll link all of those things in the description below. This guide for February is a little bit different than what I normally do, so let me explain how this is going to go. These monthly garden guides are catered to South USA garden zones 8 through 11 because we are all hot climate gardeners and that is my specialty. If you're in a colder climate, you will have to adjust the planting times. February is like a middle point when it comes to spring gardening for us hot climate gardeners. Half of us, mostly zones 11, 10, and some of 9B, have already passed or will be passing your last spring frost dates now in February, while the other half, mostly zones 8 and 9A, have last spring frost dates in March or April. Therefore, as I review each crop category, I will say, if you passed your last spring frost date, then do this. Or if you have not passed your last spring frost date, then do this. I just wanted it to be a little bit more accurate for you all. It's just until we all get beyond our spring frost dates, because then gardening is basically the same for all of us. The goal is to plant whatever will survive the heat of summer. If you do not know your last spring frost date, then please visit this website, enter in your zip code, and it will give you an estimated date. This date is very important to know because you will backtrack from there to figure out when to sow seeds indoors or figure out when you can start planting outside. All right, let's talk about all the things that can be started from seed or transplanted this month, and then I'll end this guide with important garden tasks, tips, and reminders for the month of February. Our first category of crops is corn and beans. I put them together because starting them from seed has a few similarities. If you're past your last spring frost date, you can begin direct sowing seeds for both corn and beans. If you're growing a vining bean cultivar, you can direct sow bean seeds around your rows of corn so they attach and grow up the corn stalks for support. Throw in some squash to sprawl out and grow underneath everything, and you have what is called Three Sisters gardening. This is a gardening strategy used by Native Americans to maximize growing space by companion planting beans, corn, and squash together. If your last spring frost date is in March or April, or you just struggle with poor corn and bean seed germination because maybe your soil is too cold or critters keep digging the seeds out, then you can sow one seed per cell of a 72 cell seed tray and basically grow out your own plugs. Put this tray over a heat mat to keep the soil warm for better germination. Contrary to popular belief, you don't always have to direct sow seeds for corn and beans. The only thing is you must transplant these as soon as they're 3 weeks old or they'll become root bound, which will stunt their growth, especially for corn. This technique is not so practical if you're growing fields and fields of corn. In that case, it's more efficient to direct sow the seeds. But for small backyard home gardeners with a few smaller beds of corn, this technique works out great. My last tip about growing corn specifically is most likely you're going to get the corn earworm. They're brown and they have 2 little black dots on their head that kind of look like eyes. They are very tough worms, and in Florida there's no such thing as a small worm infestation, so if you get worms, be prepared, have some spinosad in stock at home. I would say battling the corn earworm is the most common issue that other gardeners report back to me when trying to grow sweet corn. Just giving you a heads up. Other types of corn like dent and field corn are not as susceptible to the worms like sweet corn varieties in general. If I had to choose just one bean to grow for green beans, it would be the rattlesnake pole beans because they are very vigorous plants and perform well under a wide range of conditions. For dried shelling beans, I cannot recommend Puerto Rican black beans enough. This is a kind of hard to find cultivar. I do have seeds on my website. Puerto Rican black beans are extremely vigorous vining plants. They grow up my citrus trees and they produce for months and months on end. The pods are very long and have lots of seeds per pod too. As a cowpea, I recommend pink eye purple hull peas, which grow fantastic now that we're shifting towards warmer weather. If you need detailed step-by-step instructions on growing beans, I do have a full tutorial showing you how to grow them from seed all the way to harvest, which I will link below in the description. I probably have a dedicated guide on almost all of the crops that I'm mentioning in this video, so I'll just link them all below in the description. By the way, I'm also a seed and plant nursery. If you want to grow the same things that I mentioned in my videos, you can most likely find seeds or plants on my website. If you're past your last spring frost date, you can direct sow seeds for squash, cucumbers, and melons, like all of these right here. Otherwise, sow seeds 6 to 8 weeks indoors before your last spring frost date to get an early start. Word of caution with the cucumbers, squash, and melons because they are warm weather crops. Their seedlings start to struggle if temperatures fall below 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're unable to protect them if the temperatures drop, then wait another month to direct sow the seeds. I say this because yes, we are now past our last average spring frost date. What that means though is that we shouldn't get any more frost or freezing temperatures like in the 30s degrees Fahrenheit range or below, but we can still get a few more cold fronts that will drop temperatures below 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So not freezing, but still really cold for seedlings. I am prepared to cover my seedlings with hoops or different things that I get from Amazon. I attach a roll of plastic sheeting over it and secure it with clips. Super easy and quick. I will link these supplies in the description below. By doing this, I can get an early start on growing these types of crops. Another word of caution, check the seedlings every day for worm damage. The worms really love to chew up the tender new green growth of these types of crops, especially the seedlings. They can chew down an entire seedling overnight. If you notice worm damage, treat quickly with BT or spinosad and stay on top of it because once that seedling grows into a more mature plant, the stems are thicker, it's a little bit harder for these worms to be attacking and chewing them up. You just got to take some extra care of that seedling to make sure it gets to the maturity point. I know the worms are a big problem, especially for us Florida gardeners with crazy high pest pressure. So if you struggle with the worms or even squash bugs and the squash vine borer, I recommend you focus on squash cultivars in the Cucurbita moscata family, which includes these things right here. This group of squash has extra thick and hard stems, making it harder for these pests to eat these plants up. I'm not saying you won't get them at all. I'm just saying that these plants are tougher and can handle a lot more damage before ultimately being taken out by the pests. This will help increase your chances of harvesting something. It is too late for zone 10 and 11 gardeners to just get around to sowing seeds for tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. But you can plant transplants for them right now. Those of you with last spring frost dates in March and April are totally fine to sow seeds for these crops indoors right now so that they are ready to be transplanted as soon as all danger of frost has passed. The goal with these crops, the tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, is to harvest everything out before the heat of summer arrives. I just did a live garden class a couple of weeks ago where I showed how to transplant tomatoes into the garden. So if you need guidance on that, check the link in the description below. If you zone 10 and 11 gardeners really want to sow some seeds for tomatoes right now, then you potentially could squeeze in a harvest if you focus on early maturing cultivars like cherry, dwarf, micro dwarf, determinate, or early season cultivars and sow the seeds right now, like right now. Here are some cultivar recommendations that will fit those requirements. That way you know you'll harvest something before summer arrives. I have seeds on my website and I have a few tomato review videos if you want to see what they look like and how they taste, etc., to help you choose. As far as peppers and eggplants, I really like Marconi and banana peppers. They just produce a lot. If you like hot peppers, then rejoice because those things handle the heat much better and produce a lot more, way more than my sweet peppers. Also, I find that the pests really do not like hot peppers, but they'll go after my sweet peppers. If you've noticed that too, please comment below. For eggplants, I really like Black Beauty, Little Fingers, and Thai Lavender Frog because they just produce a lot without much care. If you want to make the best eggplant parmesan though, then I definitely recommend Rosa Bianca. If you plan on growing sweet potato slips from tubers, now is the time to start growing and rooting those slips. And that's for everyone, zones 8 through 11. It takes about 2 to 3 months for slips to have enough roots to be ready for transplant. Ideally, you want to transplant sweet potatoes when temperatures are consistently back up into the 80s. If you have a rainy season, like me here in Florida, our rainy season starts around June, then wait until June to plant them so you don't have to worry about watering them too much. Many directions say sweet potatoes are ready to harvest in about 90 days. I mean, you can harvest them at 90 days, but they're going to be small tubers. I like to harvest mine anywhere between 150 to 180 days, so that way the tubers are really nice and big. Speaking of root crops, February is your last chance to hurry up and direct sow seeds for carrots if you're in zones 10 and 11, because if carrots grow in high heats, they get stunted and stay super small. I recommend these heat-tolerant cultivars of carrots, or another idea is plant these smaller sized carrot varieties like Parisian or Little Fingers because they mature a lot faster. If you're not past your last spring frost date, the ground is workable, and you're not expecting any hard freezes, then you can go ahead and direct sow seeds for carrots too. Just sprinkle the seeds gently, press them down into the soil surface, and water them every day. Carrot seeds will not germinate well if they are not kept consistently moist for the first 7 days. Many directions say to harvest carrots in about 90 days, just like the sweet potatoes, but I highly recommend you give them a little bit more time so that you can harvest nice big roots. I like to wait at least 4 or 5 months before I decide to harvest mine out, except for the little ones. Those you can harvest at around 90 days. Okay, so moving on to the next crop, greens, all sorts of greens. Things are going to start heating up very quickly for us zone 10 and 11 gardeners. So take advantage of the last remaining weeks of cool weather to direct sow seeds for all sorts of greens like these right here. You can either direct sow seeds or just transplant them. For me, the easiest thing to do is to direct sow seeds in any bare spots in my garden. I like to mix in some blood meal into the soil before I direct sow those seeds, or sprinkle some in the planting hole if I'm using transplants. Blood meal is a high organic source of nitrogen, and it produces the most lush and dark leafy greens. If you're growing something just to eat its leaves, they only need some nitrogen, so blood meal is perfect for that. If you're looking for a spinach type of substitute, because in my opinion spinach is probably the absolute hardest green to grow for gardeners in zones 10 and 11, I highly recommend that you try growing tatsoi. It looks like spinach, it chops like spinach, and it can be cooked down like spinach. It does not have a strong spinach-like flavor, but it still tastes really good, and it can be substituted in all recipes that call for spinach. If you've not passed your last spring frost date, then sow seeds indoors for all of these greens about 4 to 6 weeks from your frost date to get an early start. Some other greens include mustard greens, kale, and Napa cabbage. If you've passed your last spring frost date, use transplants only, because that will ensure you harvest before the heat of summer returns. It's getting way too late to start them from seed right now. If you have not passed your last spring frost date, you can start them from seed about 4 to 6 weeks before your last spring frost date. I recommend that all hot climate gardeners plant these things in a spot that gets full morning sun and afternoon shade. This will help them last much longer into the summer. My absolute favorite type of kale is the lacinato types like Black Tuscan, Dazzling Blue, and Black Magic, because they handle the heat very well. I have had plants survive 2 years in my garden if grown in a spot that gets afternoon shade. The other types of kales easily die once the heat starts to return, which for me is about the month of April. Another pro tip, if you know you're going to be harvesting lettuce that day, water them really good, like 2 hours before you decide to harvest them. That way the plants uptake water and it makes their leaves just a little bit more crisp. Next up, we have herbs. It is okay to either transplant or direct sow seeds for all sorts of herbs if you're past your last spring frost date. Here are some ideas of herbs that are a must grow for me. They grow much better during my fall, winter, and spring. Those of us that are past our last spring frost dates can also plant lots of these types of tropical herbs. They will grow great in the extreme heat that will be returning very soon. If your last spring frost date is in March or April, start sowing seeds indoors about 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost date for all sorts of herbs. Keeping herb plants alive in hot climates is tough, so I have some tips for you all. Number 1, grow them in grow bags, because grow bags have fast drainage, keeping the soil more on the dry side. Herbs typically like a dry Mediterranean type of climate, so this helps mimic that. Here in Florida, we have a rainy season, and I used to lose a lot of my herb plants to root rot because of all the extra soil moisture. So grow bags has helped tremendously with that. And number 2, move them into a spot that gets afternoon shade once temperatures start going over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. They do not like extreme heat. Growing them in containers and grow bags makes it easy to move them around the garden into a shadier spot. It is too late to just get started sowing seeds for bulbing onions for zones 8 through 11, but we all can sow seeds for green bunching onions, or you can get scraps from the grocery store and replant them. The only exception would be zone 8 gardeners. If you're not expecting any more hard freezes, you can hurry up and plant some more bulbing onion transplants. February is zone 10 and 11's last chance to hurry up and plant radish, beets, and turnips. They don't grow very well once things start getting really hot again. Radishes are said to be ready for harvest in about 30 days. Realistically though, it takes me an additional about 3 weeks until they size up to where I like them. I tell you that so you don't worry if your radishes are still too small after 30 days. Give them some more time. They grow very easy in small spaces, grow bags, or vertical garden towers like the green stalk. Zones 8 and 9 can direct sow seeds for radish, beets, and turnips if you're not expecting any more hard freezes. If you're past your last spring frost date, you can start direct sowing seeds or transplanting all sorts of flowers. If you are not past your last spring frost date, then sow seeds indoors 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost date to get an early start. Flowers are such an integral part of my garden, as they not only beautify the space, but they attract loads of pollinators and beneficial insects. If I had to choose just 3 flowers to bring in the pollinators, it would be sunflowers, agastache, and tithonia, also known as Mexican sunflower. Sunflowers are best direct sown into the ground because they have a large taproot, especially the really tall types like Mammoth or Titan. But every time I sow seeds in the ground, critters find and eat them. So I sow sunflower seeds in deep seed tray plugs like this one, or at a minimum a 4-inch size pot. Plant flowers now so they're in place and blooming to attract beneficial insects before the bad ones start to take over in summer. Also, if you're past your last spring frost date, you can start planting flower bulbs. My personal favorites are gladiolus and dahlias. Yes, dahlias can grow right here in Florida. I often find bags of these bulbs at Sam's Club at a very cheap price. This bag of 60 gladiolus bulbs was just $15. Right now is a great time for all of us in zones 8 to 11 to plant a new asparagus bed or plant new ones into existing beds. And yes, I have successfully grown tons of asparagus right here in my Florida Zone 10A garden. I highly recommend that you purchase 2-year-old crowns so they start producing sooner, because otherwise it can take a couple years. I often find bags of crowns for very cheap at Sam's Club or Tractor Supply, but there are a lot of good online stores that sell them too. I have grown all sorts of varieties, from Mary Washington, Purple Passion, and some of the heat tolerant cultivars like UC72 and UC157. They all grow great. My number one tip when it comes to growing asparagus is that these plants take up a lot of room. My plants get 6 feet tall and are very bushy, about 3 to 4 feet wide per plant. I made the mistake of planting them in a very small raised bed, so I had to yank them all out, which is very difficult because their root systems are really large and deep. I just replanted them in this spot right here, which means I'm kind of starting over, which really sucks because they were already producing huge finger-thick spears for me. But I just had to move them all into a better spot. So no joke when people say choose the planting location wisely if you're growing asparagus. You can also sow seeds for asparagus right now if you want to go that route over buying the crowns. They are pretty easy to grow from seed. They just take a while to size up and be ready to transplant. Up next, we have loofah, moringa, roselle, and edible gourds like snake beans or bitter melon. These crops require many months in a row of warm temperatures to grow and be ready for harvest. February is still a little too cold for them, except for you South Florida gardeners in like zone 11. These are like super tropical heat loving things, so I recommend you start them from seed indoors to get a jump start on your growing season. Starting seeds for loofah and moringa can be a little tricky because they have a hard shell. Growing them in warm soil and high humidity is key to speed up germination. Roselle, also called sorrel, is very easy to start from seed, but it just doesn't like being cold. I have guides on growing all of these things from seed, which I will link below in the description. If you want to start a backyard fruit tree orchard or just add more to your collection, right now is a great time to do it. Planting now will give the trees some time to establish a root system before the extreme heat and rains of summer arrive. If I had to pick just 5 fruiting trees or plants that produce a lot without minimal effort, I would recommend these right here. I would wait until March, or for you colder climate gardeners, wait until all danger of frost has passed to plant the more tropical type of fruiting trees and plants like these right here. This right here is a lychee tree, or lychee, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I have 2 of them. This one is the Brewster cultivar and this one is Mauritius. They have to get pretty big in size before they'll start producing for you. I purchased them as 3-gallon size containers and I planted them in this spot about 2 or 3 years ago, and they still haven't produced for me, but maybe I'll get lucky this year. If you've never had lychees before, I highly recommend you go check out your Asian grocery store, because when it's lychee season, which is usually springtime around April, May, and June, you can find lots of them pretty cheap per pound. One of my favorite things to do is to drive down to Miami or like the Homestead area, because there are so many people and vendors on the side of the roads selling bags and bags of lychees for really cheap, and I will literally drive down those roads, buy a ton of lychees, eat them as I'm driving, make all my stops, visit a ton of nurseries down there. It's a really fun trip. And while you're down there, you can visit the Fruit and Spice Park too. So yeah, go there during lychee season. It's a lot of fun. Make sure you do your research and select varieties that will perform well in your area and are cold hardy down to the lowest temperature received in your garden. That way you don't have to worry about covering up your fruit trees every single winter. Now is also a great time to add trees and shrubs to your landscape. I highly recommend a type of tree that flowers to help support the pollinators, like these right here. If you didn't know, I'm also a beekeeper, and I have a few videos about that on my channel too. I can't tell you how much these types of flowering trees on my property have helped to provide a rich pollen source for my bees, especially at the end of summer and wintertime when there's not much flowering for them to forage on. Plus, just one tree supplies an enormous amount of blooms over an extended period of time for the bees. If you have any recommendations for more types of flowering trees that help support bee populations, please comment below. All right, everyone. Hopefully that gave you a lot of ideas for things you need to start growing right now. Lastly, let's discuss important garden tasks and reminders for the month of February. February is a good time to add soil amendments before you start planting up your spring garden. If you're not sure what amendments to add, I recommend you get a soil test kit. I have used this one from Amazon, which I will link below, that tested for a large amount of nutrients. And if it identified that I was deficient in any of them, it gave me recommendations on how to fix it. So very helpful. Since it's nice and cool outside, it's a good time to to mulch the garden, get caught up on garden projects, weeding, building new garden beds, etc. We just got a delivery of wood chips from Chip Drop and mulched the entire garden, so everything is nice and clean and ready to be planted. February is also a great time to prune dormant fruiting plants and trees that fruit on new wood specifically. This is super important. If you don't know which of your fruit trees and plants fruit on new wood, do some research. For example, my muscadine grapevines fruit on new wood or growth. We just heavily pruned back all of the vines to be no longer than 4 foot long. This will cause them to grow lots of new branches, which will flower and produce fruit for me later this summer. It's a good time to spray trees and fruit trees with horticultural oil to suppress or smother out various diseases and pests so you have less incidence of them in your garden. This helps against leaf miners and scale, among other things. It's too hot during most of the year for me here in Florida to spray with anything oil-based, including neem oil, because it can and has burned my plants. So I wait for the cooler months to apply oil-based treatments. Before you know it, spring will be here, and there will be a huge rush of buying up seeds, plants, supplies, fertilizers, soil, etc. So I highly recommend you start stocking up on all of these things right now. I can't tell you how many times my favorite bags of compost are out of stock because everyone in my area is buying it as they are starting their spring gardens at the same time. Or how many times seeds for something I really wanted to grow this season are just out of stock. Lastly, I wanted to make you aware of my upcoming live classes that I do right here on YouTube. Mark your calendars because on Sunday, February 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be teaching about raising backyard chickens with a tour of my coop and setup. These live classes are a lot of fun. I really enjoy talking with you guys and answering your questions in real time. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, that way you get notified of when I go live for those classes. You can find a copy of this February guide, like in text form, on the monthly garden guide section of my website so that you can print, copy, save, or share it. Or if you prefer, you can join my email group. There's a link in the description below, and I'll send it to you automatically at the beginning of each month. Well, I hope you all like this list I put together for February and it helps you get started on your spring garden. If I missed any seed or plant ideas, feel free to drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, a big thumbs up would mean a lot to me and helps my channel out more than you know. Thank you for watching and happy gardening.